Outside of its major cultural exports like anime and manga, Japanese food has reached particular acclaim worldwide. Perhaps more so than any other dish beyond okonomiyaki or taiyaki or takoyaki, that would be ramen. Ramen shops are numerous, and highly regarded ramen shops can be found throughout the world from Mexico City, Washington, D.C., to Paris. This isn't to say that ramen has declined in popularity whatsoever domestically. There are estimated to be anywhere from 10,000 to 32,000 ramen shops across Japan. This doesn't even account for the immense amount of regional varieties. But where does ramen come from? Is it Japanese? How do we determine the origins of food, and who eats ramen? That and how this all fits into Tampopo will come to be discussed, but first, let's get started on the ramen. Ramen can begin in a variety of ways with a variety of different ingredients. Since I'm making a fairly traditional tonkatsu ramen, this begins with pork bones. I've set them overnight in a water bath in order to remove any blood or particulate that was clinging to the bones. Now I'm going to boil the bones for roughly 20 minutes. This is to remove any particulate that the overnight bath didn't remove. This is also to make for a characteristically whiter tonkatsu. After the bones have been strained and scrubbed to remove truly anything still clinging to them, they're going to be set to boil now for 15 hours in a large, deep pot. For now, let's return to some of our earlier questions about food and origin. Food history can be difficult, so I decided to divide this discussion into three areas. The first is the documented, and for this example, I chose nachos, which have a fairly singular point of origin in Piedras Negras in the state of Coahuila in Mexico. They were first invented by Ignacio Anaya, who, by his nickname, was Nacho at the Victory Club where he was working. One day he decided simply to present cheese, chips, and jalapenos on a plate when asked for an appetizer, or rather an item that wasn't on the menu. Then there's the contested. This is for food that has a relatively precise point of origin or a limited geographic range, but whose actual claim to creation might be between one or two institutions. In this case, it's two major culinary powerhouses, both in Manhattan, Delmonico's and the Waldorf Astoria. Ramen exists in the speculative. While ramen has a generalized account of origin in the work of Chinese chefs arriving in Yokohama's ports around the mid to late 1800s, any idea of who was the first to serve it and where is entirely speculative. As Chinese chefs became more predominant in Japanese restaurant, ramen was adapted to fit local tastes with additions such as roasted pork and bamboo shoots. For some time, ramen even went by two names, Shina Soba and Chuka Soba. Shina Soba fell out of fashion over time due to Shina being a term used and deeply associated with Japan's World War II imperial endeavors, especially in China, or rather exclusively in China. Well, for now, let's go check on the ramen. Things certainly are progressing well, and the broth is becoming more identifiably tonkotsu. For now, I think it's time to return to our discussion. On ramen, its expansion during World War II, and from there, Tampopo. I'll also be adding some aromatics before we get right back to that. Just some lightly roasted onion and about maybe 8 or 10 cloves of garlic. Japan's loss in the Second World War resulted in a sharp cessation of rice imports from its overseas colonies, such as China and Korea. And following that, there was a flood of US imported products, such as wheat and lard. Black markets were also numerous during this period, and ramen was a relatively popular and cheap dish served at them. It's no surprise since the main ingredients necessary for its production were in such high account. Ramen provided not only relief from a tiring diet of daikon and sweet potatoes, but also from starvation. It's through this that ramen in many ways became a major part of Japan's food memory. This is how ramen is also represented in Tampopo, a sort of a force of resilience, which, as we see throughout, defies class barriers. Well, that's enough discussion. Let's go have some ramen. After 14 hours of boiling and being strained, here's the tonkatsu. So before we begin preparing our ramen, or placing any of the actual ingredients inside, we're going to heat our bowl so that when the broth is added in, there's no heat loss and it remains warm throughout the meal. We're first going to add in the tare. The tare is sort of the flavoring base for any ramen. This is sort of not only intended to provide flavor, but also balance. I made this with dried sardines, katsuobushi, and steeped it in ramen and mirin and left it overnight in the fridge. Next I'm going to add the aroma oil. This gives ramen its distinct heaviness, but also flavors it very deeply. In this case, I'm using lard, which was rendered down from the leftover fat from the chashuu with garlic. After straining in some of the tonkatsu and adding the noodles, all that remains now is the toppings. And of course, toppings are essential to any good ramen. Aside from the Naruto and the nori, and the noodles, of course, everything here I prepared on my own. The chashuu in particular, I'm particularly proud of, but the ramen eggs were also delicious. Here is my ramen. Unfortunately, I forgot to record myself adding the nori, but here it is. I decided to pair it, this traditional Japanese meal, with a rather traditional American beverage of mug root beer. This has certainly been one of the most difficult culinary endeavors I've ever approached. I will say that scene in Tampopo where Tampopo knocks over the pots and is weeping and nothing tastes the way it should to her felt very hard-hitting. I likely will not be making ramen anytime soon again, but I thank you all for having followed me along with it.